Hello, I'm Desmond Gillick. I'm filming this for a group of people in particular. However, uh, other people will be sent this video, but the group that is receiving this, you'll know who you are. Moby Dick, Chapter 1, Loomings. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos gets such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong deal of moral principle to prevent myself from deliberately stepping onto the street and methodically knocking people's hats off. Then I account it high time to set to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon the sword. I quietly take to ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, some time or another, cherish very nearly the same feeling toward the sea with me. This is fairly different from the version that I know, but it's all give or take. So that was the first passage of the first chapter of Moby Dick. We're going to have a few more of those to go. For the time being, I'm cracking open a dooski, and we're getting ready to go. I don't know anything from here on out. I have not read Moby Dick, but we'll go through this together. There now is your insular city of Manhattos, belted around by wharves and as Indian isles by coral reefs. Commerce surrounds it with her surf. Right and left, the streets take you waterward. Its extreme downtown is the Battery, where the noble mole is washed by waves and cooled by breeze, which a few hours previous were out of sight of land. Look at the crowds of water-gazers there. Circumambulate the city is a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. Go from Coral's Hook to Conti's Slip, and from thence by Whitehall northward. What do you see? Posted like silent sentinels around the town stand thousands upon thousands of mortal men fixed in ocean reveres. Some leaning against the spiles, some seated upon their pier heads, some looking over the bulwarks of ships from China, some high aloft in the rigging, as if striving to get a still betterward seaward pier. But these are all landsmen, of weekdays pent up in lath and plaster, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks. How, then, is this? Are the green fields gone? What do they hear? What do they hear? As in, why are they here? But look, here come more crowds, pacing straight for the water, and seemingly bound to dive. Strange! Nothing will content them, but the extremest limit of the land, loitering under the shady lee of yonder warehouse, will not suffice. Loitering under the shady lee of yonder warehouse will not suffice. No, they must just as nigh the water as they possibly can without falling in. And there they stand, miles of them, leagues, inlanders all. They come from lanes and alleys, streets and avenues, north, east, south, and west. Yet here they all unite. Tell me, does the magnetic virtue of the needles of the compasses of all those ships attract them hither? Once more, say you are in the country, some high land of lakes. Take almost any path you please, and 10 to 1 it carries you down in a dale, and leaves you by a pool in the stream. There is magic in it. Let the most absent-minded of men be plunged in his deepest reveres, and stand that man on his... Let the most absent-minded of man be plunged in his deepest reveres. Stand that man on his legs, set his feet a-going, and he will infallibly lead you to water, if water there be in all that region. Should you ever be athirst in the great American desert, try this experiment, if your caravan happen to be supplied with metaphysical professor. Yes, as everyone knows it, meditation and water are wedded forever. But there is an artist. He desires to paint you the dreamiest, shadiest, quietest, most enchanting bit of romantic landscape in all the valley of Saco. What is the chief element he employs? There stand his trees, each with hollow trunk, as if a hermit and a crucifix were within. And here sleeps his meadow, and there sleep his cattle, and up from yonder cottage goes a sleepy smoke. Deep in distant woodlands, shepherd's head. What? Deep in distant woodlands winds a mazy way, reaching to overlapping spurs of mountains bathed in all their hillside blue. But through the picture thus lies tranced, and through the pine tree shakes down its sighs like leaves upon this shepherd's head. Yet all were in vain, unless the shepherd's eyes were fixed upon the magic stream before him. Go visit the prairies in June, when for scores and scores of miles you wade knee-deep among tiger lilies. What is the one charm wanting? Water. There is not a drop of water here. Were Niagara but a contract of sand, would you travel your 1,000 miles to see it? Would the poor poet of Tennessee, upon suddenly receiving 2 handfuls of silver, deliberate whether to buy him a coat, which he sadly needed, or invest his money to a pedestrian trip to the Rockaway beach? Why is it almost every robust, wealthy boy with a robust, wealthy soul in him, at some time or another, goes crazy to go to the sea? Why, upon your first voyage as passenger, did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration, when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity, and own brother of Jove? Suddenly, surely, all this is not without meaning. And still deeper the meaning is that of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting, meaning of that story of Narcissus, who because he could not grasp the tormenting mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of an ungraspable phantoms of life, and this is the key to it all. Now, when I say that I am a passenger in the habit of going to sea whenever I begin to grow hazy around the eyes, and begin to overconscious of my lungs, I do not mean to have inferred that I ever go to sea as passenger. For to go as passenger, you must need to have purse, and a purse is but a rag unless you have something in it. Besides, passengers get seasick, grow quarrelsome. Besides, passengers get seasick, grow quarrelsome, don't sleep of nights, do not enjoy themselves much as a general thing. No, I never go as passenger, nor, though I am something of a salt, do I ever go to sea as commodore, or captain, or cook. I abandon the glory and distinction of such officers to those who like them. For my part, I'm not going to pause this recording. However, I've just saw a new word. Abominate. Yeah, like abominable. I abominate all honorable, respecting toils, trails, and tribulations of every kind whatsoever. It is quite as much as I can do to take care of myself, without taking care of ships, barks, brigs, schooners, and what-not. And as for going as cook, though I confess there is considerable glory in that, a cook being a sort of officer on shipboard, yet somehow I never fancied broiling fowls, though once broiled, judiciously buttered, and judgmentally salted and peppered, there is no one who will speak more respectfully, not to say reverentially, of a broiled fowl than I. It is out of this idolatrous doings of old Egyptians broiled ibis and roasted river horse that you see the mummies of those creatures and their huge bake houses in the pyramids. No, when I go to sea, I go as a simple sailor, right before the mast, plumb down on the forecastle, aloft there to the royal masthead. True, they rather order me about some, and make me jump from spar to spar like a grasshopper in a May meadow, and first this sort of thing is unpleasant enough. It touches one's sense of humor, particularly if you come of an old established family in the land, the Van Raslins or Randolphs or Hardicantuous, and more than all, if just previous to putting your hand in the tar pot, you have been lording it as a country schoolmaster, making the tallest boys stand in awe of you. The transition is a keen one, I assure you, from schoolmaster to sailor, and it requires a strong decoction of Seneca and the Stoics to enable you to grin and bear it, but even this wears off in time. What of it, if some old hunks of sea captain orders me to get a broom and sweep below the decks? What does this indignity amount to, weighed, I mean, in the scales of the New Testament? Do you think the Archangel Gabriel thinks anything less of me, because I promptly and respectfully obey the old hunks in that particular instance? Who ain't a slave? Tell me that. Well then, however the old sea captain may order me about, however they may thump and punch me out, I have the satisfaction of knowing that all is right, and everybody else is one way or other served in much the same way, either in a physical or metaphysical point of view. That is, and so... the physical or metaphysical point of view, that is. And so the universal thump is passed around, and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades, and be content. Again, I always go to sea as sailor, because they make a point of paying me for my trouble, whereas they never pay passengers a single penny that I have heard of. On the contrary, passengers themselves must pay, and there is all the difference in the world between paying and being paid. The act of paying is perhaps the most uncomfortable infliction that the two orchid thieves entailed upon us. Wow, 2 orchard thieves entailed upon us. But being paid, what will compare with it? The urbane activity with which a man receives money is really marvelous, considering that we so earnestly believe money to be the root of all earthly ills, and that on no account can a moneyed man enter heaven. Ah, how cheerfully we consign ourselves to perdition. Finally, I always go to sea as sailor because of the wholesome exercise and the pure air of the forecastle deck. For as in this world, hard winds are far more prevalent than winds from astern. That is, if you near violate the Pythagorean maximum. So, for the most part, So, for the most part, the Commodore on the quarter-deck gets his atmosphere at second hand from the sailor's view on his forecastle. He thinks he breathes it at first. But not so. In much the same way do the commonality lead the leaders in their many things, at the same time that the leaders little suspect it. But wherefore it was that after having repeatedly smelt the sea as the merchant sailor, I should now take it as my head to go on a whaling voyage. That this invisible police officer... the invisible police officer of the fates, who has constant surveillance of me, and secretly dogs me, and influences me in some uncountable way, he can better answer than anyone else. And, doubtless, my going on this whaling voyage formed part of the grand program of Providence that was drawn up a long time ago. It came in as sort of a brief interlude and solo between more extensive performances. I take it that this will be part of the bill. I take it that this part of the bill must have run something like this. Grand constented election for the presidency of the United States. Whale voyage by one Ishmael. Bloody battle in Afghanistan. Though I cannot tell why it is exactly in those stage manners, the fates put me down for shabby part of whaling voyage, when others were set down for a magnificent parts in high tragedies, and short and easy parts in Gentile comedies, and jolly parts in farces, though I cannot tell why this was exactly. Yet now that I recall all the circumstances, I think I can see a little into the springs and motives which, being cunningly presented to me now, under various disguises, induce me to set about performing the part I did, besides cajoling me into the delusion that it was a choice resulting from my own unbiased free will and discriminating judgment. Chief among these motives was the overwhelming idea of the great whale himself. Such a portentous and mysterious monster roused in all my curiosity. Then the wild and distant seas where he rolled his island bulk, the undeliverable nameless perils of the whale, these, with all the attending marvels of 1,000 Patagonian sights and sounds, helped sway me to my wish. With other men, perhaps, such things would have not been inducements. Gonna look up this word again. Inducements, I take it, but could be inductments all the same. It is inducement, thank you. But as for me, I am tormented with the everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas, on land on barbarous coasts, not ignoring what is good. I am quick to perceive an honor, a horror, and could still be social with it. Would they let me, since it is but well to be since it is but well to be on friendly terms with all the inmates of the place one lodges in. By reason of these things, then, the whaling voyage was welcome. The great floodgates of the wander world swung open, and the wild conceits that swayed to me my purpose, two and two they floated into my inmost soul, endless precisions of the whale, and, midmost of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill on the air. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2 seems a bit shorter, thankfully. How many minutes am I at? Just see. We are coming up on the 20-minute mark now. I'm gonna go to the bathroom. Sorry that this breaks immersion. This one would be pause, and then I can continue my recording later, right? That's how you continue recording. Okay. Sorry, I just had to briefly check that. Going to pause again, and I shall return, a different man than I once was. And we're back. I was thinking of recording like 3 hours of this, like just straight up. But this is a lot. Like, chapter 2 is short. Dear God, chapter 3. Like, chapter 1, Loomings, funny. Chapter 2, the carpet bag, which we will get to, fine. Chapter 3, the Spouter Inn. Chapter 4, the counterpane, fine. Chapter 5, breakfast, easy. Chapter 6, the street, easy. Chapter 7, the chapel, easy. Chapter 8, the pulpit, easy. Chapter 9, the sermon, Chapter 10, a bosom friend, fine. Chapter 11, nightgown, easy. Chapter 12, biographical, easy. Chapter 13, wheelbarrow, kinda fine. Chapter 14, Nantucket, easy. Chapter 15, chowder, fine. Chapter 16, the ship, Chapter 17, the Ramadan, Chapter 18, his mark, kinda fine, it's a bit long. Chapter 19, the prophet, easy. Like, oh God, looking further and further into this thing. I'm not gonna get cold feet. I'm gonna read chapter 2, and I'm gonna force myself to power through chapter 3 so that I can get to chapter 4. But, like, you're really, really gonna hate me reading through chapter 3. Because it's all the same, like, just long, complicated nonsense, so... Let's get into it. Moby Dick, Chapter 2, The Carpet Bag. I stuffed a shirt or two into my old carpet bag, tucked it under my arm, and started for Cape Horn and the Pacific. Quitting the good city of Old Manhattan, I dully arrived in Bedford, New Bedford. It was a Saturday night in December. Much was disappointing, but upon learning that the little packet for Nantucket had already sailed, and that no way of reaching the place would offer till the following Monday, as most young candidates for the pains and penalties of whaling stop at this same New Bedford, thence to embark on their voyage. It may as well be related that I, for one, had no idea of so doing. For my mind was made up to sail in no other than a Nantucket craft, because there was fine, boisterous something about everything connected to that famous old island, which, amazingly pleased me. Besides, though, New Bedford has of late been gradually monopolizing the business of whaling, and though in matter of poor old Nantucket is now much behind her, Nantucket was her great original, the Tyre of this Carthage, the place where the first dead American whale was stranded. Where else but from Nantucket did those aboriginal whalemen, the Redmen, first sally out in the canoes to give chase to the Leviathan? And where but from Nantucket, too, did that first adventurous little sloop put forth, partially laden with imported cobblestones? So goes the story. Nantucket, too, did that first adventurous little sloop put forth, partially laden with imported cobblestones, so the story goes, to throw at the whales, in order to discover when they were nigh enough at risk to harpoon from first bowsprit. Now having a night, a day, and still another night before me in New Bedford, ere I could embark from my destined port, it became a matter of concernment where I was to eat and sleep meanwhile. It was so very dubious looking, nay, a very dark and dismal night, bitingly cold and cheerless. I knew no one in this place. With anxious grapnels, I'll run with it. With anxious grapnels, I had sounded my pockets, and only brought up a few seconds of silver. Few pieces of silver. So, wherever you go, Ishmael, I said to myself, as I stood in the middle of a dreary street holding my bag and comparing the gloom toward the north with the darkness toward the south, wherever in your wisdom you may conclude to lodge for the night, my dear Ishmael, be sure to inquire the price, and don't be too particular. With halting steps I paced the streets, and passed on the side of the Crossed Harpoons, but it looked too expensive and jolly there. Further on, from the bright red windows of the Swordfish Inn, there came such fervent rays that it seemed to have melted the packed snow and ice before the house, for everywhere else in the congealed frost lay 10 inches thick in hard asphaltic pavement, rather wary for me when I struck my foot against the flinty projections, because from hard, remorseless service the soles of my boots were at most miserable plight. Too expensive and jolly again, I thought, pausing one moment to catch my broad glare in the street, to watch the broad glare in the street, and hear the sounds of tinkling glasses within. But go on, Ishmael, I said at last. Don't you hear? Get away from the door. Your patched boots are stopping the way. And so I went on. I now by instinct followed the streets that took me waterward, for there, doubtless, were the cheapest, if not the cheeriest inns. Such dreary streets, blocks of blackness, not houses, on the other hand, and there were blocks of blackness, not houses, on the other hand, and here and there a candle, like a candle moving about in a tomb. At this hour of the night, of the last day of the week, the quarter of town proved all but deserted. That quarter of the town proved all but deserted. But presently I came to a smoky light proceeding in a low, wide building, the door of which stood invitingly open. It had a careless look, as if it were meant for the use of the public. So, entering, the first thing I did was stumble over an ash-box on the porch. Ha! I thought. As the flying particles almost choked me. Are these the ashes from the destroyed city Gomorrah? But the Crossed Harpoons and the Swordfish. This, then, must be the sign of the trap. However, I picked myself up, and hearing the loud voice within, pushed on and opened a second interior door. It seemed the great black Parliament sitting in Tophet. 100 black faces turned round in their rows to peer, and beyond, a black angel of doom was beating a book in pulpit. It was a Negro church, and the preacher's text was about blackness and darkness, and the weeping and wailing of teeth gnashing there. Ha, Ishmael, I muttered, backing out, wretched entertainment at the sign of the trap. Moving on, I at last came to a dim sort of light not far from the docks. I heard a forlorn creaking in the air, and looking up, saw a swinging sign over the door with a white painting on it, faintly representing a tall, straight jet of misty spray, and the words underneath, "The Spouter Inn, Peter Coffin." Coffin? Spouter? Rather ominous in that particular connection. Hold on, it looks to be a different spelling of connection, but I'm gonna check just to be sure. Yeah. Oh, it's just the French for connection, which I take it was just Old English for connection. Thought I. But it is common name in Nantucket, they say, and I suppose Peter here is an immigrant from there. As the light looked so dim, and the place, for the time, looked quiet enough, and the dilapidated little wooden house itself looked as if it might have been carted here from the ruins of some burnt district, and as the swinging sign had a poverty-stricken sort of creak to it, I thought that here was the very spot for cheap lodgings, the best of the pea coffee, and the best of pea coffee, spelt PEA for those chuckling along at home. Oh, right, I forgot that Chapter 2 was the easy one, and that Chapter 3 was the long one. Coffin. Oh, I already read that one. It was a queer sort of place. A gable-ended old house, one side placed, as it were, and leaning over sadly, it stood on a sharp, bleak corner, where the tempestuous wind Euroclydon kept up a worse howling than it ever did about poor Paul's tafted cross. Ever did about poor Paul's tossed craft. Euroclydon, nevertheless, is a mighty pleasant zephyr to anyone indoors, with his feet on the hob, quietly toasting in bed. In judging of that tempestuous wind outside, or whether thou observest it from slashless window, where the frost is on both sides, and of which the White Death, spelt WIGHT, is the only glazier. Ugh. True enough, thought I, as this passage occurred to my mind. Hold on. My mind. Old black letter, thou reasonest well. Yes, these eyes are windows, and this body of mine is the house. What a pity they didn't stop up the... take it this in context means, like, in armor. What a pity they didn't stop up the chinks and crannies, though, and thrust a little lint here and there. But it's too late to make any improvements now. The universe is finished, the coop stone is on, and the chips were carted off a million years ago. Poor Lazarus there, chattering his teeth against the curbstone for his pillow, and shaking off the tatters of his shiverings. He might plug up both ears with rags, and put a corn cob into his mouth, and yet that would not keep out the tempestuous Euroclydon. Euroclydon. Am I saying this right? Euroclydon? What? Pronunciation. I'm looking up a video on how to say it. Euroclydon? No, that's not. I'm not. Euroclydon. Euroclydon, says the old Dives. In his red silken wrapper, he had a redder one afterwards. Pooh, spelt P-O-O-H. What does that mean, exactly? Used to express disgust at an unpleasant smell. Literally poo. Got it. So, Winnie the Pooh? Winnie meaning. It's just a male and female name of Welsh origin. Fair one, white and smooth, soft happiness, or fair and pure. Sorry for the tangent there. What a fine frosty night! How Orion glitters! What northern lights! Let them talk of their oriental summer. Let them talk of their oriental summer climes of everlasting conservation. Give me the privilege of making my own summer with my own coals. But what thinks Lazarus? Can he warm his blue hands by holding them up to the grand northern lights? Would not Lazarus rather be in a Sumatra than here? Would he not far rather lay down in lengthwise along the line of the equator? Yea, ye gods, go down to the fiery pit itself in order to keep out the frost. Gods not capitalized, mind you. Now that Lazarus should lie standard there on the curbstone before the front of Dives, the door of Dives, this is more wonderful than that an iceberg should be moored to one of the Moluccas. It's probably a biblical reference, seeing as this author really seems fond of it. Oh, it's an archipelago in Indonesia, but this is an older spelling for it. They're currently spelt Maluckus. This is spelt Moluccas. Moluccan are an archipelago in eastern Indonesia. Technically, they are located on the Halmara Plate with it doesn't matter. Yet Dives himself, he too lives like a czar in an ice palace made of frozen sighs, and being a president of a temperance society, he only drinks tepid tear of orphans. But no more of this blubbering now. We are going a-whaling, and there is plenty of that yet to come. Let us scrape the ice from our frosted feet, and see what sort of place this spouter may be. I'm going to pause now, take another break, and I'll be back to read you Chapter 3, The Spouter Inn. That was a much more extended break than I wanted. It's like 5 chapters worth. So this will be the majority of it. The majority of this video. Moby Dick, Chapter 3. The Spouter Inn. Entering the gable-ended Spouter Inn, you find yourself in a wide, low, straggling entry with old-fashioned wainscots, rendering one of the bulwarks of some condemned old craft. Reminding one of the bulwarks of some condemned old craft. On one side hung a very large oil painting, so thoroughly besmoked and every way defaced that in a uniquely cross-light by which you viewed it, it was only by diligent study and a series of systematic visits to it, and you carefully inquiry of the neighbors, that you could anyway arrive at the understanding of its purpose. Such unaccountable masses of shades and shadows that at first you almost thought some ambitious young artist in the time of New England hags had endeavored to delineate chaos bewitched, but by dint of much and earnest contemplation and oft-repeating ponderings, and especially by throwing open the little window toward the back of the entry, you at last come to a conclusion that such an idea, however wild, might not be altogether unwarranted. But what most puzzled and confounded you was the long, limber, pretentious black mast of something hovering in the center of the picture, over 3 blue, dim, perpendicular lines floating in nameless yeast. A boggy, soggy, squitchy picture, truly enough to drive a nervous man distracted. Yet was a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that nearly froze you to it, till you involuntarily took an oath with yourself to find out whatever marvelous painting meant. Whatever that marvelous painting meant. Ever and anon, and a bright, but alas, ever and anon a bright, but alas, a deceptive idea would dart you through. It's the Black Sea It's the Black Sea in a midnight gale. It's the unnatural combat of the 4 primal elements. It's the blasted heath. It's a Hyperborean winter scene. It's the breaking up of an icebound stream of time. Of the icebound stream of time. But at last, all these fancies yield to that pretentious something that's the picture's midst. That, once found out, all the rest were plain, but stop. Does it not bear a faint resemblance to a gigantic fish, even the great Leviathan himself? In fact, the artistic design seemed this, a final theory of my own, partially based upon the aggregated opinions of many aged persons with whom I conversated on the subject. The picture represents a Cape Horner in a great hurricane, the half-founded ship weltering there with its 3 dismantled masts alone visible, and an exasperated whale, purposing to spring clean over the craft, is in the enormous act of impaling himself upon the 3-headed masts. The opposite wall of this entry was hung over with a heathenist array of monstrous clubs and spears. Some were thickly set with glittering teeth resembling ivory saws, other were tufted with knots of human hair, and one was sickle-shaped, with a vast handle sweeping around it like a segment made of new-mown grass by a long-armed mower. You shudder as you gazed, and wonder what monstrous cannibal and savage could ever have gone a death-harvesting with such a hacking, horrifying implement. Mixed with these were rusty old whaling lances and harpoons, all broken and deformed. Some were storied weapons. With this one long lance, now widely elbowed, 50 years ago did Nathan Swan kill 15 whales between sunrise and sunset. That harpoon, like a corkscrew now, was flung in Javan's seas and run away with by a whale, years afterwards at the Cape of Blanco. Years afterwards slain off the Cape of Blanco. The original iron entered nigh the tail, like the restless needle sojourning in the body of a man, travelled full 40 feet, and at last found embedded in the hump. Crossing the dusky entry, and on through yon low arched way, cut through what in old times must have been a great central chimney with fireplace all around, you enter the public room. A still duskier place is this, with low and ponderous beams above, and such old wrinkled planks beneath, that you would almost fancy you trod off some old craft's cockpits, especially of such a howling night, when this corner-anchored old ark rocked so furiously. On one side stood a long, low, shelf-like table covered with cracked glass cases, filled with dusty rotaries gathered from the wide world's remotest nooks. Projecting from the further angle of the room stands a dark-looking den, the bar, a rude attempt at a right whale's head. Be that how it may, there stands a vast arch bone of the whale's jaw, so wide a coach might have driven A coach might almost drive beneath it. Within are shabby shelves arranged round with old decanters, bottles, flasks, and in those jaws of swift destruction, like another cursed Jonah, which by name indeed they call him, bustles a little withered old man, who, for their money, dearly sells the sailors' deliriums and death. Abominable are the tumblers into which he pours his poison. Through the cylinders within, the villainous green... Also, just to clarify, it does say without dash within. So I didn't read without wrong. This is how it's written. Through the cylinders within, the villainous green goggling glasses deceitfully tapered downwards to a cheating bottom. Parallel meridans, rudely pecked into the glass, sounding these footpads goblets. Fill to this mark, and your change is but a penny. To this, a penny more. And so on to the full glass, a Cape Horn measure, which you may gulp down for a shilling. Upon entering the place, I found a number of young seamen gathered around a table, examining by a dim light divers specimen of scrimshander. I sought the landlord, and telling him I desired to be accommodated with a room, received from answers that this house was full, not a bed unoccupied. But avast, he added, tapping his forehead, you hain't no objections to sharing a harpooner's blanket, have ye? I suppose you're going a whalin', so you'd better get used to that sort of thing. As written. One moment. I told him that I never liked to sleep two in a bed, that if I should ever do so, it would depend upon who the harpooner might be, and that if he, the landlord, really had no other place for me, and the harpooner was not decidedly objectionable, why, rather than wander farther about a strange town on so bitter a night, I would put up with a half of any decent man's blanket. I thought so. All right, take ye seat. Supper? You want supper? Supper'll be ready directly. I sat down on old wooden settle. Settle? Carved all over like a bench on the battery. At one end, ruminating tar was still further adorning it with jackknife. At one end, a ruminating tar was still further adorning it with his jackknife, stooping over and diligently working away at the space between the legs. He was trying his hand at a ship under full sail, but he didn't make much headway, I thought. At least some 4 or 5 of us were summoned to our meal in an adjoining room. It was as cold as Iceland, no fire at all. The landlord said he couldn't afford it. Nothing but 2 dismal tallow candles, each with a winding sheet. We were faint to button up our monkeys' jackets, and hold to our lips cups of scalding tea with our half-frozen fingers. But the fare was of a most substantial kind, not only meat and potatoes, but dumplings. Good heavens! Dumplings for supper! One young fellow in a green box coat addressed himself to these dumplings in a most direful manner. My boy, said the landlord, you'll have a nightmare to a dead serenity. Landlord, I whispered, that ain't the harpooner, is it? Oh, no, said he, looking a sort of diabolical funny. The harpooner is a dark-complexioned chap. He'd never eat dumplings. He eats nothing but steaks, and he likes 'em rare. The devil he does, says I. Where is the harpooner? Is he here? He'll be here afore long, he answers. I could not help it, but I began to feel suspicious of this dark-complexioned harpooner, At any rate, I made up my mind that if it so turned out to be that we should sleep together, he must undress and get into bed before I. Supper over, the company went back to the bar-room, when, knowing not what else to do with myself, I resolved to spend the rest of the evening at a looker-on. As a looker-on. Presently a loitering noise was heard without. Starting up, the landlord cried, "That's the Grampus's crew." Oh, that's not Oxford comma. "I seed her reporting in the offering this morning. A 3 years' voyage, and a full ship. Hurrah, boys! Now we'll have the latest news from the Fijis." I take it that means Fijis. A trampling of sea boots we heard in the entry. The door was flung open, and in rolled a wide set of mariners enough, enveloped in their shaggy watchcoats, and with their heads muffled in woolen comforters, all bedarned and ragged, and their beards stiff with icicles. They seemed an eruption of beers from Labrador. They had just landed from their boat, and this was the first house they entered. No wonder, then, that they made a straight wake for the whale's mouth, the bar, with the wrinkled little old Jonah, there officiating. Soon poured them out brimmers all round. One complained of a bad cold in his head, upon which Jonah mixed him a little potion-like of gin and molasses, which he swore was a sovereign cure for all colds and cathars whatsoever, no mind how long standing, or whether caught off the coast of Labrador, or in the weather side of an ice island. The liquor soon mounted onto their heads, as it generally does with an errantist toppers newly landed from sea. They began capering about most obstrusely. I observed, however, that one of them held somewhat aloof, and though he seemed desirous not to spoil the hilarity of his shipmates by his own sober face, yet upon the whole he refrained from making as much noise as the rest. The man interested me at once, and since the sea gods had ordained that he should soon become my shipmate, though he was a sleeping partner one, so far as this narrative is concerned, I will here venture upon a little description of him. He stood full 6 feet in height, with noble shoulders, and a chest like a coffer-dam. I have seldom seen such brawn in a man. His face was deeply brown and burnt, making his white teeth dazzling by the contrast, while in the deep shadows of his eyes floated some reminiscences that did not seem to have much joy. His voice at once announced that he was a southerner, and from his fine stature, I thought he would be one of those tall mountaineers from the Allegheny Ridge in Virginia. Hold on. I actually want to learn how to say this. This certainly isn't an old word for Appalachian, is it? One of the most geological mountain forming events that formed the Appalachian Mountains and the Allegheny Mountains. Okay. So it is just like a combination of two mountain ranges. Whoa, there. Okay. In Virginia, where the reveille of his companions had mounted its heights. This man slipped away unobserved, and I saw no more of him till he became my comrade on the sea. In a few minutes, however, he was missed by his shipmates, and being, it seems, for some reason a huge favourite of them when they cry a huge favourite with them, they raised a cry of "Bulkington! Bulkington! "Where's Bulkington?" and darted out of the house in pursuit of him. It was now 9 o'clock, and the rooms seeming almost supernaturally quieter after these orgies, I began to congratulate myself upon the little plan that had occurred to me previous to the entrance of the seaman. No man prefers to sleep in a two-bed. In fact, you would get a good deal rather not to sleep with your own brother. I don't know how it is, but people like to private when they are sleeping, and it comes to sleeping with an unknown stranger, in a strange inn, in a strange town, and that stranger a harpooner, that your objections indefinitely multiply, nor was there any earthly reason why I, as a sailor, should sleep two in a bed more than anybody else, for sailors no more sleep two in beds at sea than bachelor kings do ashore. For sailors sleep no more in two beds at sea than bachelor kings do ashore. To be sure they sleep together in one apartment, but to have your own hammock, and cover yourself with your own blanket, and sleep inside your own skin. The more I pondered over the harpooner, the more I abominated the thought of having sleeping with him. It was fair to presume that, being a harpooner, his linen or woolen, as the case might be, would not be of the tidiest, certainly none of the finest. I began to twitch all over. Besides, it was getting late, and my decent harpooner ought to be home and going bedward. Suppose now he should stumble in upon at midnight. How could I tell from what vile hole he had been coming? "Landlord, I've changed my mind about that harpooner. I shan't sleep with him. I'll try the bench here." "Just as you please. I'm sorry I can't spare ye tablecloth for a mattress. It's a plaguery rough board here." Feeling of the knots and notches. But wait a bit, Scrimshander. I've got carpenter's plane in the bar. Wait, I say, I'll make ye snug enough. So, trying, he proceeded the plane. So saying, he procured the plane, and with his old silk handkerchief, the finest, dusting the bench, vigorously set to planning away at my bed, the while grinning like an ape. The shavings flew right and left, till at last the plain iron came bump against an indestructible knot. The landlord was spraining his wrist, and I told him for heaven's sake to quit. The bed was soft enough to suit me, and I did not know how he was planning in the world to make it eddier of pine plank. So gathering up the shavings with another grin, and throwing them into the great stove at the middle of the room, he went about his business, and left me in a brown study. I now took measure of the bench, and found that it was a foot too short, but could be mended with a chair, but it was a foot too narrow, and the other bench in the room was about 4 inches higher than the planed one, so there was no yoking them. I decided the first bench lengthwise could be the only clear space to the wall. I then placed the first bench lengthwise along the only clear space against the wall, leaving a little interval between them, for my back to settle down in. But I soon found that there came such a draught of cold air over me from under the sill of the window that this plan would never do at all, especially as another current from the rickety door met me at the one from the window, and both together seemed a series of small whirlwinds in the immediate vicinity of the spot where I had thought to spend the night. The devil fetch that harpooner, I thought. But stop. I couldn't steal a march on him. Bolt his door inside and jump in bed, not to be waked by the most violent knockings. It seemed no bad idea, but upon second thought I dismissed it. For who could tell what the next morning, as soon as I popped out of the room, the harpooner might be standing at entry, all ready to knock me down. Still, looking round, Still, looking round me again, and seeing no possible chance of spending an insufferable night unless in some other person's bed, I began to think of the after that I might be cherishing unwarrantable prejudices against this unknown harpooner. I'll wait a minute. I'll wait a minute. He must be dropping in before long. I'll have a good look at him, and then perhaps we could become jolly good bedfellows after all. There's no telling. But though the other boarders kept coming in in ones, twos, and threes, and going to bed, there was yet no sign of my harpooner. "Landlord," said I, "what sort of chap is he? Does he always keep such late hours?" And now hard upon 12 o'clock. The landlord chuckled again with his lean chuckle, and seemed to mightily tickled at something beyond my comprehension. "No," he answered, "he's generally an early bird, early to bed and early to rise. Yes, he's the bird what watches the worm. But tonight he went out a-peddling, you see, and I don't see what on earth keeps him so late, unless, maybe, he might not be still. He might not... Unless, maybe, he can't sell his head. Can't sell his head? What sort of bamboozling story are you telling me?" Getting into a towering rage. "Do you pretend to say, landlord, that this harpooner is actually engaged in the blessing Saturday night, or rather Sunday morning, in peddling his head around the town?" "That's precisely it," said the landlord, and I told him he couldn't sell it here. The market's overstocked." "With what?" shouted I. "With heads, to be sure. Ain't there too many heads in this world?" I tell you what it is, landlord," I said calmly. "You better stop spinning that yarn to me. I'm no green." "Maybe not," taking out the stick and whittling it a toothpick. "But I rather guess you'll be brown if that harpooner hears you slanderin' his head." "I'll break it for him," said I, now flying into a passion again of uncontrollable fargo over the landlord. "It's broke already," said he. "Broke?" said I. "Broke? What do you mean?" "Sartain, that's the reason he can't sell it, I guess." Sartain. And that's the reason why he can't sell it. Obsolete spelling of certain? Come on. "Certain, and that's the reason why he can't sell it, I guess." "Landlord," said I, going up to him as cool as Mount Helka in a snowstorm. "Landlord, stop whittling. You and I must understand one another, and that too without delay. I come to your house and want a bed. You tell me you can only give me half of one, and that the other bed belongs to a certain harpooner. And about this harpooner, who I have yet not seen, you persist is telling me is a most mystifying and exasperating stories, tending to beget in me an uncomfortable feeling toward this man whom you design for my bedfellow, a sort of connection, landlord, which is an intimate and confidential one. In the highest degree, I now demand of you to speak out to me who and what this harpooner is, and whether I shall, in all respects, be safe to spend the night with him. And in the first place, you will be so good as to unsay the story, and to speak to me and tell me who this harpooner is, and whether I shall be in respects to Spain. Never mind. And you will be so good as to unsay the story about selling his head, which, if true, I take to be good evidence that this harpooner is stark mad, and I have no idea of sleeping with a madman. And you, sir, I mean, landlord, you, sir, will be trying to induce me by doing so knowingly, and would thereby render yourself liable to a criminal prosecution. "Wall," said the landlord, fetching a long breath, "that's a purty long salmon for you. Sarmon for a chap that rips a little now and then. But be easy. This here harpooner, I've been telling you, I've been telling you, have just arrived from the South Seas, where he bought a land bombed New Zealand. Great Curios, you know. What? Where he bought a lot of bombed New Zealand heads, great Curios, you know, and sold them all, and sold all on 'em but one, and sold all on 'em but one, and that he's trying to sell tonight, 'cause tomorrow's Sunday, and you cannot be selling human heads about the streets when folks going to churches. He wanted to last Sunday, but I stopped him just as he was going out the door with 4 heads strung on string, all the airth like a string of onions. This account cleared up the otherwise unaccountable mystery, and showed that the landlord, after all, had no idea of fooling me. But at the same time, could I think the harpooner who stayed out on a Saturday night to clean into the holy Sabbath engaged in such a cannibal business of selling heads to dead adulterers? Idolaters? I take it it's adulterers, but in Old English spelling, wow, that can of soda got warm fast. Depend upon it, landlord, that the harpooner is a dangerous man. He pays regularly, was the rejoined. But come, it's getting dreadful late, and you better be turning flukes. It's a nice bed, Sal. It's a nice bed. Sal and me slept in that air bed when we were spliced, and there's plenty of room for 2 to kick about in that bed. It's an almighty big bed, that. Why, afore we give it up, Sal used to use or Sam and little Johnny in the foot of it. But I got dreaming and sprawling about that one night, and somehow Sam got pitched to the floor, and came near breaking his arm. After that, Sal said it wouldn't do. Come along here, I'll give you a glim and a jiffy. I'll give ye a glim and a jiffy. So saying, he lighted a candle and held it toward me, offering to lead me the way. But I stood irresolute, when looking at a clock in the corner. I exclaimed, I vum it's Sunday. I vum? Avow, I swear I vum. I soon put harness on myself, as worry about that lazy mule. What? No, you can't. Avow, swear. What's avow? To be declared assuredly. Oh, she avowed her innocence. Okay. It's the fucking... God, Old English. Hold on. It's Sunday, and you won't see that harpooner tonight. He's come and anchor somewhere. Come along, then. Do come, won't he come? I considered the matter a moment, and then upstairs we went, and I was ushered into a small room, cold as a clam, and furnished, sure enough, with a prodigious bed, almost big enough, indeed, for any 4 harpooners to sleep abreast. There, said the landlord, placing a candle on a crazy old sea chest that did double duty as a washing stand and center table. There, make yourself comfortable now, and good night to ye. I turned around from eyeing the bed, but he had disappeared. Folding back the counterpane, I stood over the bed. Though none of the most elegant, it yet stood the scrutiny tolerably. Well. I then glanced round the room, and beside the bedstand and center table, I could see no other furniture belonging to the place, but a rude shelf, the 4 walls, and a prepared fireboard representing a man striking a whale. Of things not properly belonging to the room, there was a hammock lashed up and thrown into the floor in one corner, also a large seaman's bag containing a harpooner's wardrobe, no doubt, in lieu of land trunk. Likewise, there was a parcel of outlandish bone fishhooks on the one end covering the fireplace, and a tall harpoon standing at the head of the bed. But what is in this chest? I took it up, held it close to the light, and felt it, and smelt it, and tried every way possible to arrive at some satisfactory conclusion concerning it. I can compare it to nothing but a large doormat, ornamented around the edges with little tinkling tags, something like the stained porcupine quills around Indian moccasin. There was a hole or slit in the middle of the mat, as you see with South American ponchos, but it could possibly be any sober harpooner would get into the doormat and parade the streets of any Christian town for that sort of guise. I put it on to try it, and weighed me down like a hamper, being uncomfortably shaggy and thick. I thought it a little damp, and I found it a little damp, as though this mysterious harpooner had been wearing it out on a rainy day. I went up in it to a bit of glass stuck against the wall, and I never saw such a sight in my life. I tore myself out of it with such hurry that it gave me I went up into it a bit of a glass stuck behind the wall, and I never saw such a sight in my life. I tore myself out of it with such a hurry I gave myself a kink in the neck. I sat down on one side of the bed, and commenced thinking about this head peddling harpooner, about this doormat. Eventually thinking some time on this bedside, I got up and took off my monkey jacket, and then stood in the middle of the room thinking. Then I took off my coat, and a little more than my shirt sleeves. And thought a little more in my shirt sleeves. But beginning to feel very cold now, half undressed as I was, and remembering what the landlord said about the harpooners not coming at all that night, it being so very late, I had no more ado, but jumped out of my pantaloons and boots, and blowing out the light tumbled into bed, and condemned myself to the care of heaven. Whether that mattress was stuffed with corn cobs or broken crockery, there is no telling, but I rolled around in it a good deal, and could not sleep for a long time. At last I slid off into a light doze, and had pretty nearly made a good offering toward the land of Nod, when I heard a heavy footfall in the passage, and saw a glimmer of light coming into the door. Lord save me, thinks I, that must be the harpooner, the infernal head peddler. But I lay perfectly still, and resolved not to say a word till spoken to. Holding a light in one hand, and that identical New Zealand head in the other, the stranger entered the room, and without looking toward the bed, placed his candle a good few feet away from me, on the floor in the corner, and then began working away at the knotted cords on the large bag before I spoke. The large bag I before spoke of as being in the middle of the room, as being in the room. I was all eagerness to see his face, but he kept it averted for some time while employing the unlacing of Bag's mouth. This accomplished, however, he turned around when, good heavens, what a sight! Such a face! It was a dark, purplish, yellow color, and there was stuck all over with blackish-looking squares. Yes, it's just as I thought. He's a terrible bedfellow, and he's been in a fight, got dreadfully cut, and here he is, just from the surgeon. At that moment he chanced to turn his face toward the light, and I painfully saw that they could not be stickling plasters at all, but those they could not be sticking plasters at all, those black squares on his face, on his cheeks. They were stains of some sort or another. They were stains of some sort or other. As first I knew not what to make of this, but soon an inkling of truth had occurred to me. I remembered a story of a white man, a whaleman too, who falling among the cannibals had been tattooed by them. I concluded that this harpooner, in the course of his distant voyages, must have met a similar adventure. And what is it, thought I, after all? It's only as outside a man can be honest in any sort of skin. But then, what to make of his unhealthy complexion? That part of it, I mean, lying round about, and completely independent of squares of tattooing. To be sure, it might be nothing but a good coat of tropical tanning, but I never heard of suns tanning a white man into purplish-yellow one. However, I had never seen the South Seas, and perhaps the sun there had produced these extraordinary effects upon the skin. Now, while all these ideas were passing through me like lightning, the harpooner never noticed me at all, but after some difficulty having opened his bag and he commenced fumbling in it, he presumably pulled out some sort of tomahawk and a sealskin wallet with hair on. Placing these on the old chest in the middle of the room, he then took out a New Zealand head. A ghastly thing enough, and crammed it down into the bag. He now took his hat off, a new beaver hat, when I came nigh singing out with fresh surprise. There was no hair on his head, none to speak of at least, and nothing but a small scalp knot twisted up in his forehead. He had his bald purplish head now looked for all the world like a milkweed skull. What? His purplish head now looked for all the world like a milkweed skull. Had not the stranger stood between me and the door, I would have bolted out of there quicker than I ever bolted a dinner. We're almost there. Even as it was, I thought something of slipping out the window, but it was a second floor back. I'm no coward, but what to make of this head-peddling purple rascal altogether past my comprehension. Ignorance is the parent of fear, and being completely nonplussed and confounded by the stranger, I confess I was now more afraid of him as if it was the devil himself who had thus broken into my room in the dead of night. In fact, I was so afraid of him that I was not game enough just then to address him and demand a satisfactory answer concerning what seemed inexplicable to him. Is this still recording? Yes, it is. Oh, dude, I just saw the time. That's so fucking sad. I quacked a little to think of it. A peddler of heads, too. Perhaps the head of his own brother. He might take a fancy to mine. Heavens! Look at that tomahawk! But there was no time for shuddering, for now the savage went about something that completely fascinated my attention. He convinced me that he must indeed be a heathen. Going to this heavy grego, or warpall, or dreadnought, which he had previously hung on the chair, he fumbled in his pockets, and produced a length of curiously deformed image with a hunch on his back, and exactly the color of 3-days-old Congo baby. What? Which he had previously hung on the door, he fumbled in the pockets and produced a length of curious little deformed image with a hunch on its back, and exactly the color of a 3-days-old Congo baby. Remembering the embalmed head, at first I almost thought that this mankin was a real baby preserved in a similar manner. But seeing that it was not a limmer, and that it was glistened a good deal like a polished ebony, I continued that it must be nothing but a wooden idol, which indeed it proved to be, for now the savage goes up to the empty fireplace, removing the papered fireboard, sets up his little hunchbacked image, like a 10-pin, between the andrions, the chimney jabs at all the bricks and very sooty, and so I thought the fireplace made a very appropriate little shrine or chapel for his Congo idol. I now screwed his eyes hard toward the half-hidden image, but feeling but ill at ease in meantime, to see what was next to follow. First he takes about a double handful of shavings out of his grego pocket, and places them carefully before the idol. Then, laying out a bit of ship biscuit on top, and applying the flame at the lamp, he kindled the shavings into a sacrificial blaze. Presently, after made hastily snatches into the fire, and still hastier with the withdrawal of his fingers, whereby he seemed to be scorching them badly, he at least succeeded in drawing out the biscuit, then blowing off the heat and ashes a little, and made a polite offer of it to the little negro. But still the little devil did not seem to fancy such dry sort of fare at all. He never moved his lips. All these strange antics were accompanied by the stranger guttural noise from the devotee, who seemed to be praying in a sing-song, or else singing some pagan psalmody or other, during which his face twitched about in the most unnatural manner. At last, exhausting the fire, he took the idol up very unceremoniously, and bagged it again in his grego pocket, as carelessly as if he were a sportsman bagging dead woodcock. All these queer proceedings increased my uncomfortableness, and seeing him now exhibiting strong symptoms of concluding his business operations, and jumped into bed with me, I thought it was high time, now or never, for the light to be put out, to break the spell which I had been so long bound. But the interval I spent in deliberating what to say was a fatal one. Taking up his tomahawk from the table, he examined the head of it for an instant, and holding it to the light, with his mouth at the handle, he puffed out great clouds of tobacco smoke. The next moment the light was exhausted, and this wild cannibal, tomahawk beneath his teeth, sprang into bed with me. I sang out, I could not help it now, and gave a sudden grunt of astonishment. He began feeling me. Stammering out something I knew not what, I rolled away from him against the wall, and then, conjuring him, whoever or whatever he might be, to keep quiet, and let me up and light the lamp again. But his guttural response satisfied me at once that he had comprehended my meaning. "Who a devil are you? Who a devil you? He said at last. You no speak, dame, I kille. And so saying, the lighted tomahawk began flourishing about in the darkness. "Landlord, for God's sake, Peter Coffin," I shouted. "Landlord, watch, coffins, angels, save me! Speake, tell me who he be, or dammy, I kill he." Again growled the cannibal, while his horrid flourishings of the tomahawk scattered the hot tobacco ashes about me till I thought my linen would get on fire. But thank heaven, at that moment landlord came into the room, light in hand, and leaping from the bed I ran up to him. "Don't be afraid now," he said, grinning again. "Queequeg here wouldn't harm a hair on your head." "Stop your grinning," shouted I. "Why didn't you tell me about that infernal harpoon was a cannibal? I thought ye'd know it, but I didn't tell ye he was peddling. But didn't I tell ye he was peddling heads around? But turn flukes again and go to sleep. Queequeg, look here. You sabby me, I sabby you. You and this man sleepy, you sabby?" "Me sabby plenty," grunted Queequeg. puffing away at his pipe and sitting upon the bed. "You getty in," he added, motioning to me with his tomahawk and throwing the clothes at one side. He really did not have any civil, but a really kind and charitable way. He really did this in not only a civil, but a really kind and charitable way. I stood looking at him for a moment, thinking, for all his tattooings, he was on the whole a clean, complete, comely-looking cannibal. What's all this fuss that I had been making about, thought to myself. This man's a human being just as I, and he has just a reason for fear as me, as I have to be afraid of him. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Landlord, said I, tell him to stash the tomahawk there, or pipe, or whatever you call it, and tell him to stop smoking. In short, I will turn in with him, but I do not fancy having a man smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous. Besides, I ain't insured. He told Queequeg. This beginning told Queequeg. He once again complied, and again politely motioned for me to get into bed, rolling over to one side as much as to say, "I won't touch a leg o' ye." "Good night, landlord," I said. "You may go." I turned in, and never slept better in my life. That was Chapter 3 of Moby Dick. The counterpane is a bit shorter. It fits on one screen, so that's compensation for something. I'm going to take a quick break, and I shall return. And I think I'm just going to do Chapter 4. I think that's where I'll leave it. But I might come back to this bit, depending on how many chapters are in Moby Dick. So, I will leave you to be. Alright, hello again. It's been, actually, no joke, 12 hours. Whoa. Okay, sorry to all the headphone listeners out there. Why is it so loud all of a sudden? No, it's going through my blue snowball still. Test. Have I been reading it this close the whole time? I think I was yesterday. I forget the voice that I was reading it in, but if I was the former Gillick which I expect myself to be, it would be in a tone such as this. Moby Dick, Chapter 4, The Counterpane. Okay, so this is a screen's worth of a chapter, which is good. Less for everything else. Here we are. Moby Dick, Chapter 4, The Counterpane. Upon waking the next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. The counterpane was of patchwork, full of old, little party-colored squares and triangles, and his arm was tattooed all over with an indeterminable Cretan labyrinth of a figure. No two parts were of one precise shade, owing, I suppose, to his keeping his arm at sea unmethodically in sun and shade, his shirt sleeves irregularly rolled up at various times. This same arm of his, I say, looked for all the world like a stripe of that same patchwork quilt. Indeed, partially lying on the arm did when I first awoke. I could hardly tell it from the quilt, they so blended their hues together, and it was only by the sense of light and pressure that I could tell that Queequeg was hugging me. My sensations were strange. They let me try to explain them. When I was a child, I remember a somewhat similar circumstance that befell me. Whether it was a reality or a dream, I could never entirely settle. The circumstance was this. I had been cutting up some caper or other. I think I was trying to crawl up a chimney, as I had been a little sweep for a few days previous, and my stepmother, who somehow or other was at the time whipping me or sending me to bed supperless. My mother dragged me out by the legs of the chimney and packed me off to bed, though it was only 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June 21st. On the 21st June, and the longest day in and the longest day in the year in our hemisphere. I felt dreadily, but there was no help for it. So upstairs I went to my little room on the 3rd floor, undressed myself as slowly as possible as to kill time, and with a bitter sigh got between the sheets. I lay there dismally calculating that 16 entire hours must elapse before I could hope for a resurrection. 16 hours in bed. The small of my back ached to think of it. And it was so light, too, the sun shining in the window, and a great rattling of coaches in the street, and the sound of grey voices all over the house. I felt worse and worse. At last I got up, dressed, and softly going down into my stockinged feet, sought out my mother, and suddenly threw myself at her feet, beseeching her as a partially favor to give me a good slippering for my misbehavior, anything indeed but condemning me to lie abed such a miserable length of time, such an unendurable measure of time. But she was at best a most conceited of stepmothers, and back I had to go to my room. For several hours I lay there broad awake, feeling a great deal worse than I had ever done ever since the greatest subsequent misfortunes. At last I must have fallen into a troubled nightmare of a doze, and slowly waking from it, half steeped in dreams, I opened my eyes, and there before me sunlit room was now wrapped in utter darkness. Instantly I felt a shock running through all my frame. Nothing was to be seen and nothing was to be heard, but a supernatural hand seemed placed in mine. My arm hung over the counterpane, and the nameless, unimaginable, silent form or phantom which was the hand to which the hand belonged seemed closely seated by my bedside. For what seemed ages piled on ages, I lay there, frozen, with a most awful fears, not daring to drag away my hand, yet ever thinking that if I could stir but 1 single inch, the horrid spell would be broken. I knew not how this conscience at last glided away from me, but waking in the morning, I shudderingly remembered it all, and for days and weeks and months and years afterwards I lost myself in confounding attempts to explain the mystery. Nay, to this very hour I often puzzle myself with it. Now, take away the awful fear, and my sensations at feeling the supernatural hand in mine were very similar, in their strangeness, to those which I experienced on waking and seeing Queequeg's pagan arm thrown around me. But at length all the past night's events soberly recurred one by one in fixed reality, and then I lay only alive to the comical predicament, for though I tried to move his arm, unlock his brigadoon grasp, his bridegroom clasp, yet, sleeping as he was, he still hugged me tightly, and though naught but death should part us twain, I now strove to rouse him. "Queequeg!" But the only answer was a snore. I then rolled over, my neck feeling as if it were in a horse collar, and suddenly felt a slight scratch. Throwing aside the counterpane, and lay there Throwing aside the counterpane, there lay the tomahawk sleeping by the savage's side, as though it were a hatchet-faced baby. A pretty pickle, I thought. I abbed here in a strange here. I abed here on a strange house in a broad day, with a cannibal and a tomahawk. Queequeg, in the name of goodness, Queequeg, wake! At length, by dint of how much wriggling, and loud and incessant expulsions upon the unbecomingness of his hugging and fellow male in a maternal sort of style, I succeeded in extracting a grunt. And presently he drew back his arm, shook himself all over like a Newfoundland dog just from the water, and sat up in bed, stiff as a pike-staff, looking at me, and rubbing his eyes as if he did not altogether remember how I came to be there, through a dim consciousness of knowing that something about me seemed slowly dawning over him. Meanwhile, I lay quietly eyeing him, having no serious misgivings now, and bent upon narrowly observing so curious a creature. When, at last, his mind seemed made up upon touching the character of his bedfellow, he became, as it were, reconciled to the fact. He jumped out upon the floor, and by certain sighs and sounds gave me to understand that, if it pleased me, he would dress first, then leave me to dress afterward, leaving the whole apartment to myself. Thinks I, Queequeg, under the circumstance, this is a very civilized overture, but the truth, these savages are an innate sense of delicacy. Say what you will, it is a marvelous how essentially polite they are. I pay this particular compliment to Queequeg because he treated me with so much civility and consideration, while I was guilty of great rudeness, staring at him from the bed and watching his toilet motions. For the time, my curiosity getting the better of my breeding. Nevertheless, a man like Queequeg you don't see every day, and his ways were well worth unusual regarding. He condemned dressing at the top by donning his beaver hat, a very tall one, by the by. Really? A very tall one, by the by. And then, still minus his trousers, he hunted up his boots. What under the heavens he did it for, I cannot tell, but the next moment he was to crush himself, boots in hands, and hat on, under the bed, when, from sundry violent graspings and strainings, I inferred he was hard at work booting himself, though by no law of politely proprietary that I had ever heard of. Is any man required to be private when putting on his boots? But Queequeg, do you see, was a creature in the transition stage, neither caterpillar nor butterfly. He was just enough civilized to show off his outlandishness in the strangest possible manners, his education not yet completed. He was an undergraduate. If he had not been a small degree civilized, he very probably would have been troubled himself with boots at all. He very probably would not have troubled himself with boots at all. But then, if he had not been still a savage, he never would have dreamt of getting under the bed. He never would have dreamt of getting getting under the bed, He never would have dreamt of getting under the bed to put them on. At last he emerged with his hat very much dented and crushed down over his eyes, and began creaking and limping about the room, as if, not being much accustomed to boots, his pair of damp, wrinkled cowhide ones, probably not made to order either, rather pinched and tormented him from the first go of a bitter cold morning. Seeing now that there was no curtains on the window, and that the street being very narrow, the house opposite commanded a plain view into the room, and observing more and more the indecorous figure of that Queequeg made, staving about with little else but his hat and boots on, I begged him as well as I could to accelerate his toilet somewhat, and particularly to get into his pantaloons as soon as possible. He complied, and then proceeded to wash himself. At that time in the morning, any Christian would have washed his face, but Queequeg, to my amazement, contented himself with restricting his ablutions. Ablutions? Learning a new word now. It is ablution. The act of washing oneself, often used for humorous formal effect. In Christianity, ablution is a prescribed washing of part or all of the body in possessions. Whoa. Ablution is a prescribed washing of part or all of the body or possessions, such as clothing or ceremonial objects, with the intent of purification and dedication. In Christianity, both baptism and foot washing are forms of ablution. Well, now you know. Ablution to his chest, arms, and hands. He then donned his waistcoat, and taking a piece of hard soap on the washstand center table, dipped it into the water and commenced lathering his face. I was watching to see where he kept his razor when, lo and behold, he takes the harpoon from the bed corner, slips it out of the long wooden stock, unsheathes the head, wets it a little on his boot, then, striding up to the bit of the mirror against the wall, begins a vigorous scraping, or rather harpooning, of his cheeks. Thinks I, Queequeg is using his Roger's best cutlery with a vengeance. After I wondered the less at this operation, when I came to know what a fine steel the head of harpoon is made, and how exceedingly sharp the long straight edges were always kept. The rest of his toilet was soon achieved, and he proudly marched out of the room, wrapped up in his great pilot monkey jacket, and sporting his harpoon like a marshal's baton. Chapter 5. Breakfast. I quickly followed suit, and descending into the bar room accosted the grinning landlord very pleasantly. I cherished no malice towards him, though he had been skylarking me with the little manner in my bedfellow. With not a little in the matter of my bedfellow. However, a good laugh is a mighty good thing, and rather too scarce a good thing. There's more the pity. So, if any one man in his proper person affords stuff for a good joke to anybody, let him not be backward, but let him cheerfully allow himself to spend and be spent in that way, and that the man has anything bountifully laughable about him. Be sure that there is no more in that man than you perhaps think for. The bar-room was now full of boarders, who had been dropping in the night previous, and whom I had not yet gotten a good look at. They were nearly all whalemen, the chief mates, the second mates, and the third mates, the sea carpenters, the sea coopers, the sea blacksmiths and harpooners, and the ship keeps, a brown and brawny company with bosky beards, and unshorn shaggy set, an unshorn shaggy set, all wearing monkey jackets for morning gowns. You could pretty plainly tell how long each one had been ashore. This young fellow's health check is like a sun-toasted pear in hue, and would seem to smell almost as musky. He could not have been 3 days from his Indian voyage. The man next to him looked a few shades lighter. You might say a touch of Satan wood is in him, and his complexion of a third still lingers in a tropic tawn, I take a former spelling for tan, but slightly bleached withal. He doubtless has tarried whole weeks ashore. But who could show a cheek to Queequeg, which, bared his various tints, seemed like an Andes western slope, and show forth in one array, concentrating climates, zone by zone. "Grub ho!" now cried the landlord, flinging open the door, and in we went to breakfast. They say that men who have seen the world thereby come quite at ease in manner, quite self-possessed in company. Not always, though. Ledyard, the great New England traveller, and Mungo Park, the Scotch one, of all men, they possessed at least assurance in their parlour, but perhaps the mere crossing of Siberian in a sledge drawn by dogs as Ledyard did, or by taking a long solitary walk on an empty stomach in the Negro heart of Africa, which was the sum of poor Mungo's performance. This kind of travel, I say, may not be the best mode of attaining a high social polish. Still, for the most part, that sort of thing is to be had anywhere. These reflections just here are occasioned by the circumstance that after we're all seated at the table, and I was preparing to hear some good stories about whaling. To my no small surprise, nearly every man maintained a profound silence, and not only that, but they looked embarrassed. Yes, here was a set of sea dogs, many whom, without the slightest bashfulness, had boarded great whales in the great seas, in the high seas, entire strangers to them, and duelled them dead without winking. And yet here they sat at social breakfast table, all of the same calling, all kindred tastes, looking round as sheepishly at each other as though they had never been out of sight of some sheepfold among the Green Mountains. A curious sight, these bashful bears, these timid warrior whalemen. But as for Queequeg, why, Queequeg sat there among them, at head of the table, too, it so chanced, as cool as an icicle. To be sure I cannot say much for his breeding. His great admirer could have been cordially justified his bringing his harpoon to breakfast with him, and using it there without ceremony, reaching over the table with it to the imminent jeopardy of many heads, and grappling the beefsteaks towards him. But that was certainly very coolly done by him, and everyone knows that in most people's estimations, to do anything coolly is to do it gently. We will not speak of Queequeg's peculiarities here, how he eschewed coffee and hot rolls, and how applied and undivided attentions to beefsteaks done rare. Enough, that was when breakfast was over, and he withdrew, like the rest of them, into the public room, lightened his tomahawk pipe, and was sitting there quietly digesting and smoking in his inseparable hat on, when I sallied out for a stroll. Chapter 6. The Street. If I had been astonished at first catching a glimpse of so outlandish an individual as Queequeg circulating among the polite civilized society of a town, the astonishment soon departed upon taking my first daylight stroll through the streets of New Bedford. In thoroughfares nigh the docks, any considerable seaports will frequently offer to view at the queerest look nondescripts from foreign parts. The queerest looking nondescripts from foreign ports. Even in Broadway and Chestnut Streets, the Mediterranean mariners will sometimes jostle and affrighten ladies. Regent Street is not unknown to Lascars and Malays, and at Bombay and the Apollo Green, the Yankees have often scared the natives, but New Bedford beats all Water Street and Wapping. In these last-mentioned haunts you see only sailors, but in New Bedford, actual cannibals standing chatting at street corners, savages outright, many whom carry on their bones unholy flesh. It makes a stranger stare. But besides the fee gangs, totem borers, aromangans, Panaganians, and Brigandins, and besides the wild specimen of the whaling craft which unhealed reel about the streets, you will see other sights still more curious, certainly more comical. Their weekly arrival in the town, scores of green Vermonters and New Hampshire men, all athirst to gain the glory of the fishery. They are mostly young, of stalwart frames, fellows who have felled forests, and now seek to drop an axe and snatch the whale lance. Drop the axe and snatch the whale lance. Many are as green as the green mountains whence they came. In some things you would think them but a few hours old. Look there, that chap strutting round the corner. He wears a beaver hat and swallowed green tailcoat. He wears a beaver hat and swallow-tailed coat, grilled with a sailor belt and sheath knife. Here comes another with the sou'western, and a Bombinese cloak. No town-bred dandy will compare with a country-bred one. I mean a downright bumpkin dandy, and a fellow that, in the dog days, will mow his 2 acres in buckskin gloves for fear of tanning his hands. Now when a country dandy like this takes it into his head to make a distinguished reputation and joins the great whale fishery, you should see the comical things he does upon reaching the seaport. In bespeaking his sea outfit, he orders bell-buttons to his waistcoat, straps to the canvas trousers. Ah, poor hayseed! How bitterly will burst those straps in the first howling gale, when thou art driven, straps, buttons, and all, down to the throat of the tempest. But think not that this famous town had only harpooners, cannibals, and bumpkins to show their visitors. Not at all. Still, New Bedford is a queer place. Had it not been for us whalemen, the tract of land would this day perhaps have been in a hollowing condition as the coast of Labrador. As it is, parts of her back country are enough to frighten one. They look so bony. The town itself is perhaps the deariest place to live in all New England, for its land is it is a land of oil, true enough, but not like Canaan, a land also of corn and wine. The streets do not run with milk, nor in the springtime do they pave them with fresh eggs, yet, in spite of all this, nowhere in all America will you find a more patrician-like houses, parks, and gardens more opulent than in New Bedford. Whence they came, how planted upon these once scraggy scoria of a country. Go and gaze upon the iron emblematical harpoons round yonder lofty mansions, and your questions will be answered. Yes, all these brave houses and flowery gardens came from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. One and all, they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. Can Herr Alexander perform a feat like that? In New Bedford, fathers, they say, give whales for dowers to their daughters, and portion of their nieces with a few porpoises apiece. You must go to New Bedford to see a brilliant wedding, for, they say, they have reservoirs of oil in every house, and every night recklessly burn their lengths at the spermaceti candles. Spermaceti, I take it it's just whale candle, made of sperm whale. Nope, that's something different entirely. Spermaceti is a waxy substance found in the head cavities of the sperm whale. Spermaceti is created in the spermaceti organ inside the whale's head. This organ contains as much as 1,900 liters of spermaceti. Gonna take a little sip here. In summertime, the town is sweet to see, full of fine maples, long avenues of green and gold, and in August, high in the air, the beautiful and bountiful horse chestnuts. Candelabra-wise, proffer the passer-by their tapering, upright cones of congregated blossoms. So omnipotent is the art which in many a district of New Bedford had superinduced bright terraces of flowers upon the barren refuse rocks thrown aside at creation's final day. And the women of New Bedford, they bloom like their own red roses. The roses only bloom in summer, whereas the fine carnation of their cheeks is perennial as sunlight in the seventh heavens. Elsewhere match that bloom of theirs ye cannot, save in Salem, where they tell me young girls breathe such musk their sailor sweethearts smell them miles offshore, as though they were dragging high the odorous Mollucus instead of the puritanic sands. Okay, I can read the next few chapters. I'll read up until chapter 9, because dear fucking God, chapter 9 is long. Alright, I'm going to take a quick break after reading 3 chapters back to back to back, and I shall return. Was that 2 chapters? No, that was 3 chapters. I shall return with Chapter 7, The Chapel. Hello and welcome back. I think you can hear the low purr of my washing machine and dryer. I was doing laundry. Yeah, I'm looking at the sound wave for Audacity, and I think it is recording that. I'm going to go see if I can fix this problem. Hold on. Did that really change it at all? No, you can still hear it. Well, you're just going to have to cope if you've made it 2 hours in. Dear God. How much time is left on the dryer? You know what? I'm not going to take a big time skip here. 32 minutes on the dryer, 36 on the washer. Okay. So this can work if I just speed read. It's like, what, 10 minutes a chapter? I don't know how much I've been averaging. How many chapters do I have? 3? 2? 1, go! Bow, wow. 2 chapters. Oh, yeah. I can fucking bang these out right now. Moby Dick. Chapter 7, The Chapel. In this same New Bedford there stands a whaleman's chapel, and there are a moody fisherman, and stands a whaleman's chapel, and few are there moody fishermen, shortly bound for the Indian Ocean or Pacific, who fail to make a Sunday visit to the spot. I am sure that I did not. Returning from my first morning stroll, I again sailed out upon this special errand. The sky had changed from a clear, sunny cold to driving sleet and mist. Wrapping myself in a shaggy jacket of cloth called bearskin, I fought my way against the stubborn storm. Entering, I found small, scattered congregations of sailors, and sailors' wives and widows. A muffled silence reigned. A muffled silence reigned, only broke at times by the shrieks of the storm. Each silent worshipper seemed purposely sitting apart from each other, as if still silent grief were insular and incommunicable. The chaplain had not yet arrived, and there still silent islands. And there these silent islands of men and women sat sat steadfast, eyeing several marble tables with black borders, masoned into the walls on either side of the pulpit. 3 of them ran something like the following, but I do not pretend to quote. Scared by the memory of John Talbot, who, at age 18, was lost overboard near the Isle of Desolation off Patagonia, November 1st, 1836. This tablet is erected to his memory by his sister. Sorry, I said scared to the memory previously, but it's actually sacred to the memory of Robert Long, Willis Ellery, Nathan Coleman, Walter Canny, Seth McKay, and Samuel Gleig, forming one of the boat's crews of the ship Elijah, who were towed out of sight by a whale, and on an offshore ground in the Pacific, December 31st, 1839. This marble is here placed by the surviving shipmates, sacred to the memory of the late Captain Ezekiel Hardy, who in the bows of his boats was killed by a sperm whale off the coast of Japan, August 3rd, 1833. This tablet is erected to the memory by his widow. Shaking off the sleet from my ice-glazed hat and jacket, I seated myself near the door, and turning sideways was surprised to see Queequeg near me. Affected by the solemnity is how I'm going to assume you pronounce this, but can never be too sure. Solemnity of the scene, which just means like solitarily, a state of quality of being serious or dignified. His ashes were laid to rest with great solemnity, a formal, dignified rite or ceremony. The ritual of the church was observed in all of its solemnities. Affected by the solemnity of the scene, there was a wandering gaze of incredulous curiosity at his countenance. I'm looking up a new word here. Countenance, meaning a person's face or facial expression, support or admit as acceptable or positive. And his countenance. At his countenance. This savage was the only person present who seemed to notice my entrance, because he was the only one who could not read, and, therefore, was not reading those frigid inscriptions on the wall. Whether any of the relatives of the seamen whose names appeared there now were among the congregation I knew not, but so many of these uncorded accidents in the fishery, and so plainly did several women present wear their countenance, if not the trappings of some unceasing grief, that I feel sure that here before me were assembled those in whose unhealing hearts had the sight of those bleak tablets sympathetically caused old wounds to bleed fresh. Oh, ye whose dead lie buried beneath the green grass, who stand among flowers, can say, Here lies my beloved. Ye not know the desolation that broods in bosoms like these. What bitter blanks in those black-bordered marbles which cover no ashes! What despair in those immovable inscriptions! What deadly voids and unbidden infidelities in the lines that seem to gnaw upon the faith and refuse resurrections to the beings who have placelessly perished without a grave! As well might those tablets stand in the cave of Elephantia as here. In what census of living creatures, dead of mankind, are excluded, why is it that a universal proverb says of them, that they tell no tales, though containing more secrets than the Goodwin sands? How is it that to his name, who yesterday departed from the other world, we prefix so significant and infidel a word, yet we do not thus entitle him, if he but embarks on the remotest Indies for his living earth? Why the life insurance companies pay death fortunes upon immortals? In what eternal, unstirring paralysis, a deadly, hopeless trance, yet lies antique Adams who died 60 round centuries ago? How is it that we still refuse to be comforted by those who are nevertheless who we nevertheless maintain are dwelling in unspeakable bliss? Why all the living so strive to hush all the dead? Wherefore but the rumors of a knocking in a tomb will terrify the whole city? All these things are not without their meanings. But faith, like a jackal, feeds among the tombs, and even from those dead doubts she gathers most vital hope. It needs scarcely to be told with what feelings, on the eve of Nantucket voyage, I regard these marble tablets, and by the murky light of the darkened, doleful day I read the fate of a whaleman who had gone before me. Yes, Ishmael, the same fate may be thine. But somehow I grew merry again. Delightful inductments to embark. Fine chance for promotion, it seems. Aye, a stove boat will make me an immortal by brevet. Yes, there is death in the business of whaling, a speechlessly quick, chaotic bundling of man into eternity. But what then? Methinks we have hugely mistaken this matter of life and death. Methinks that what they call my shadow here on earth is my true substance. Methinks that looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters observing the sun through the water, and thinking the thick water the thinnest of air. Methinks my body is but the lays of a better being. The fact that my body, who will, take it, I say, is not me, is... In fact, take my body, who will, take it, I say, it is not me, and therefore 3 cheers for Nantucket, and come a stove boat and stove body when they will, for stave my soul, Jove himself cannot. I'll take a quick pause and then read chapter 8, like very quick pause. So, is it louder because the washing machine? Yeah, it is. Oh, God. Maybe I'll wait a minute. Because I took a much longer break than I expected to. I found this website called UberDuck that, it's like the AI generated, like, you get Tupac to say anything. And that's where I am right now, so... I guess I'll have to take another break. Another longer break. Oh. It did just quiet down. It quieted down again. Okay. More in business. Chapter 8. The Pulpit. Oh, right. Sorry, I didn't do the full. Moby Dick. Chapter 8. The Pulpit. I had not been seated very long ere a man of certain venerable robustness entered. Immediately as the storm-pelted door flew back upon admitting him, a quick regardful eyeing of him by all the congregation sufficiently attested that this fine man was the chaplain. Yes, it was the famous Father Maple, the so-called by the whalemen, among whom he was a very great favorite. He had been a sailor and a harpooner in his youth, but for many years he had dedicated his life to the ministry, and now, at the time I now write, Father Maple was in the hardy winter of a healthy old age, that sort of old age which seems mere merging into a second flowering youth, for among all the fishers of his wrinkles, the shore captain, the there shone certain mild gleams of a newly developing bloom, the spring verdure peeping forth, even beneath February's snow. The spring verdure peeping forth, even beneath February's snow. No one having previously heard his story could for the first time behold Father Maple without the utmost interest, because there were certain engrifted clerical peculiarities about him, imputable to those to that adventurous maritime life had led. When he entered, I observed that he carried no umbrella, and certainly had not come in his carriage, for his tarpaulin hat ran down with melting sleet, and his great pilot cloth jacket seemed almost to drag to the floor with the weight of the water that it had absorbed. However, hat and coat and overshoes were one by one removed, and hung up in little space in an adjacent corner, when, arrayed in a decent suit, he quietly approached the pulpit. Like most old-fashioned pulpits, it was a very lofty one, and since irregular stairs to such a height would, by its long angle with the floor, seriously contract the already small area of the pulpit, the architect, it seemed, had acted upon the hint of Father Maple, and finished the pulpit without a stairs, substituting a perpendicular side ladder, like those used in mounting a ship from a boat at sea. The wife of a whaling captain, had provided the chapel with a handsome pair of red worsted man-ropes for this ladder, which, being itself nicely headed and stained with a mahogany color, the whole contrivance, considering what manner of chapel it was, seemed by no means in bad taste. Halting for an instant at the foot of the ladder, and with both hands grasping the ornamental knobs of the man-ropes, Father Maple cast a look upward, and then, with a truly sailor-like but still reverential dexterity, hand over hand, mounted the steps as if it were in ascending to the main top of his vessel. The perpendicular parts of this side ladder, as is usually the case with swinging ones, were of cloth-covered rope. Only the rounds were wood, so that every step there was a joint. At my first glimpse of the pulpit, it had not escaped me, however, that, however convenient for a ship, these joints in the present instance seemed unnecessary, for I was not prepared to see Father Maple, after gaining the height, slowly turn round, and stooping over the pulpit, deliberately drag up the ladder step by step, till the whole was deposited within, leaving him impregnable in his little Quebec. I pondered some time without fully comprehending the reason for this. Father Maple enjoyed such a wide reputation for sincerity and sanctity that I could not suspect him of courting notoriety of any mere tricks of the stage. No, thought I, there must be some sober reason for this thing. Furthermore, it must symbolize something unseen. Can it be, then, but that by the act of physical isolation he signifies his spiritual withdrawal for the time from all outward worldly ties and connections? Yes, for replenished with the meat and wine of the word, to the faithful man of God, this pulpit, I see, is a self-containing stronghold, a lofty Etherbustinian, a lofty Etherbustinian, with a perennial wall of water within the walls. But the side ladder was not the only strange feature of the place, borrowed from the chaplain's former seafarings. Hold on, I think my mom just called me. Terribly sorry. I was wondering when that was going to happen. I just figured it would happen eventually, but I thought, so close yet so far. From the chaplain's former seafarings. Jeez. Said that line like 40 times. Between the marble cenotraphs on either hand of the pulpit, the wall which formed its back was adorned with a large painting representing a gallant ship beating against a terrible storm of a lee coast of black rocks and snowy beakers. But high above the flying scud and dark rolling clouds, there floated a little isle of sunlight, which from beamed forth an angel's face, and this bright face shed a distant spot of radiance upon the ship's tossed deck, something like that silver plate now inserted into the Victory's plank where Nelson fell. Ah, noble ship, the angel seemed to say, beat on, thou noble ship, and bear a hardy helm, for lo, the sun is breaking through, the clouds are rolling off. Cernest ashore is at hand. Nor was the pulpit itself without a trace of the same sea taste that had achieved the ladder in the picture. Its panelled front was with the likeness of the ship's bluff bows, and the Holy Bible rested on a projecting piece of scroll-work fashioned after a ship's fiddle-headed beak. What could be more full of meaning? For the pulpit is ever the earth's foremost part. All the rest come in its rear. The pulpit leads the world. From hence is the storm of God's quick wrath is first described, and the bow must be the earliest brunt. From thence it is the God of breezes fair. From thence it is the God of breezes, fair or foul, is first invoked in favorable winds. Yes, the world's a ship on its passengers out, and not a voyage complete, and the pulpit is its prow. So that was the first 8 chapters of Moby Dick. I'll be back, if you remind me, that is, in like another 3 months to read the other 8 after this. There's 135 chapters of Moby Dick, by the way, for the unenlightened. And it looks like it just gets longer from here. But, we'll make it work. So, thank you all for listening. Once again, terribly sorry about my mother yelling down to me. I know that didn't interrupt the flow as much as me pausing to look up words, but, is what it is. Thank you for listening. Thank you for spending the time, if you made it here naturally, to the 2 hour and almost the 18-minute mark. I think which is where I will end this video. We have roughly 20 more seconds together. So, thank you. May God keep you all in good health. May you eventually find your infinite sea, and may you rejoice in the bountiful harvest that comes from ship-bearing. Thank you. That didn't stop it. Rats. Well, a lot less symbolic now.